So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome from Scotland to you wherever you are viewing this morning, whether you're in our beautiful country or whether you're in other parts of the UK, or indeed if you are abroad, because I know we have a number of viewers who join us from all over the world. So good morning, or indeed good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. This is the third live episode of Tigers and Teddies. My name's Gary Robinson, and I'm honoured to be your chair for this series. And of course, this wouldn't be possible without this lady, Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk. Suzanne, good morning to you.
Good morning, Gary. It's lovely to see everyone. It's lovely to welcome you back to another episode of Tigers and Teddies, and to know that this thinking about teddies and their power to comfort all of us really seems to be inspiring people. When we first launched the book, you can see them lots behind me. We had only ever planned to have one episode, but people were so interested, it just expanded into a whole summer series. So I think it's fantastic that so many people are getting to think about this in deeper ways, and that I can invite so many guests to come and tell their stories. I'm just delighted to have you all here.
Well, it's wonderful. We have the chat facility. We're broadcasting via Zoom, of course, and your messages and how you interact with each other on a fortnightly basis is fascinating. Some of the information that comes through, you're sharing experiences. So please, can we encourage you to use the chat facility and chat to each other as we go through the next hour. And also, we're on Twitter, as you can expect, and messages will be going out as the hour goes on. We have a hashtag Tigers and Teddies. Tigers and is the proper word, not the squiggly thing. Tigers and Teddies, hashtag Tiger and Teddies, Tigers and Teddies. So we would like you to tweet, please, as we go along. So this morning we are looking at boarding school and boarding school survivors. It's been prompted by Tony's story, which is in the book, and we'll look at that. Tony himself is Tony Gammage, and his story, as I said, is in the book. He went to boarding school at the age of 7, spent his adulthood reflecting on how that experience has changed him and challenged him throughout his life. And Tony studied art and then art therapy, and believes that actually art saved him. I'll come to Tony in just a second. And our second guest this morning is John Fulton. Now, John was an art teacher and then retrained as an art therapist. He worked in the NHS for a number of years, including holding the post of principal art psychotherapist, working with people with complex and emotional challenges, and he believes very much in the power of art therapy. So there is a link and a theme, and I think it's going to be interesting, Suzanne, to see where the conversation goes this morning. I'm very much looking forward to it. So please, as you're watching this, please feel free to participate. So Tony, if I could come to you first of all. Tony, good morning. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, Gary. How are you?
I'm really good. And you know what? I'm so delighted that we've got the opportunity to do this, because I wanted to ask you so many questions 3 or 4 weeks ago at the book launch, because you told an absolutely fascinating story. You're a filmmaker. We talked a little bit about your film, Norton, Grimm and Me, which we discussed previously. I think we're going to see a clip at some point. And I want to read a little bit shortly from Suzanne's book. And John, come to you for a second. John, good morning. It's good to see you. And thank you for giving up your Saturday morning for us. For the uninitiated like me, could you just tell me and people watching what an art therapist and then a principal art psychotherapist did and does, actually?
In 1 minute.
Take your time.
It's art therapy is a profession that started in the 40s, around the 40s. And one of the pioneers of art therapy was a woman called Joyce Lane in Scotland, who worked in the TB sanatoria, but also in the Berlin prison. And she was working in the special unit that many people will have heard of. And art therapy is kind of, it's art plus psychotherapy-informed practice. So our training as art therapists is intended to help us to be with people in a particular way and give the client, the patient, the space to be. And so, that was my introduction to it. After I'd been teaching for 10 years, I realized there was so many youngsters who had massive problems in schools, and I found that they were finding sanctuary in the art room. And I was really curious about that, because I think it was just my personality, my past history, etc., where I kind of recognized that they were struggling. And so I created opportunities for young people who really struggled in the system. And that kind of led me really to question what I could do. And so after 10 years of teaching, and I taught in primaries as well, I decided that I needed to know more. And I went to Goldsmiths College, where I trained in art therapy. And that training it was lifelong, really. I kind of became an art psychotherapist. Now, there's 2 titles that are protected by the Health Professions Council. That's the council that regulates occupational therapists, radiographers, paramedics, psychologists, and we became regulated in 1997. And I use both titles, but if I want to help people to understand what they're getting into with me, I'll use the art psychotherapy title mostly, because I think it's clearer in terms of it not being diversional or soft or whatever. It can be, but I'm working to understand the inner world that people experience and to help them to make connections to themselves.
The reason, John, the reason that I really like what you do and that I was keen to have you come this morning is that understanding the power of art to create healing.
Yeah.
So that we're not just focusing, the trauma is really important that we think about. And that's why, and Tony's story helps us to think about where trauma and loss and disconnection lie in places that people might not have considered. But John, having you to bring, to deepen art therapy helps us to think about the healing that comes with it as well. And it's unusual that we get to talk about healing as much as maybe we talk about trauma today. And so I really wanted to put that together today. And so, so glad you're here.
We're learning more from the divided brain, Ian McGilchrist.
Yes.
But also within the art therapy world, there's a lot happening in terms of neuroscience and how people are affected by art making. And art making is I suppose it's a kind of transitional and transactional experience.
Yes, exactly.
Where people can, when they do art, including young children, they're tuning out from the world in a way, but in a safe way, and then able to kind of there's a self-healing takes place.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good place to bring Tony's story in so that we can start to fit that together. So
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. I'll come back to you shortly. So Tony, in the light of John's story, could you just tell us a little bit about your personal story? We won't talk about the film just yet, but just take us through your journey. I mentioned you went to boarding school at the age of 7. It obviously had a great effect on you, but just talk us through that story if you would.
So yeah, we lived in Scotland actually at the time, and I was sent to a boarding school in Ayrshire, and I was about 7, I think. It probably wasn't the worst boarding school out there, but it did make kind of Dickens look quite fluffy. It was very, very harsh. It was a culture of fear. That's how they control people. Culture of fear, aggression, and I'd say violence, really, and humiliation. That's not everything, but I think that's kind of what I remember. I think the sort of striking thing was that I had 3 sisters and they were sent to a different boarding school. So yeah, it was a massive financial sacrifice to my parents. But obviously I think we all felt that we were the sacrifice, actually. So it's sort of one of those sort of things.
And when you talk about that violence and that intimidation, are you talking about staff and your fellow pupils?
No, it was staff. The fellow pupils, and I suppose that was the good thing about it was that, as I remember it, quite a long time ago, the sort of fellow pupils, we did kind of, I think we felt we were in this together, mostly, and that the enemy were the teachers, really. Yeah.
And you use the Dickens term. It's really interesting because, Tony, and I'm going to be very polite here because I am polite. We're not talking that long ago in terms of when you went to school.
Yeah, quite long ago. Between 40 and 50 years, shall we say? Yeah, quite a long time ago.
And I suppose if we balance it out and say, we're going to talk about the trauma that being in the boarding school environment can cause people, but I think it's fair to say that it's not everybody. We're not painting everybody with the same brush in this conversation.
I'm telling my story. I'm not out there to tell other people's story, but I think there are things that are very particular. The trauma is very particular. There's a kind of certain type of trauma that's very particular to boarding school, in that there's many layers of double binds within being sent to boarding school, in that it's a privilege to go to boarding school, and yet it feels like the opposite. So you can't really complain about it. It's as I said, it's a sacrifice for your parents, but as I say, you feel like you're the sacrifice. There's also some message that your parents are saying, we love you, so we're going to send you away. So there's lots of mixed messages, and there's something about the status of it. We're seeing this at the moment, playing itself out in politics, is that there's a great deal of status to going to boarding school, and yet you're humiliated when you go there. And then then they train you to turn you into the humiliator. So the new boys are humiliated, and then the sort of older boys are sort of almost trained into the humiliators.
Can I go to the? Sorry, Suzanne.
Actually, Gary, can I come in just for a second? I'm watching chat come in, and 2 key themes that are already emerging is that we've got some people who are clearly here because someone they love also went to boarding school. So Lena Carter has said that her husband was sent away at age 8, and that's really powerful language, sent away. And that's picking up on what you're saying, Tony, that it feels like you are sent away from your family. And that then means that love becomes quite complicated and complex. So you grow up as a child experiencing that part of love is to be sent away. And that's where attachment wounds start to come from, because love then doesn't feel close. It feels like away. So that's one important theme in this morning. And a second theme that's coming up that really validates and underlines what you're saying, Tony, is somebody has already said the number of members of our government who were sent away to boarding school as young children. And that's important to think about.
It's 2/3 of Boris Johnson's cabinet went to boarding school.
Say that louder, Tony, so that people can think about that.
2/3 of Boris Johnson's cabinet went to boarding school.
And so if we call boarding school for many people a form of trauma, and some people will find that very edgy to think about, but that is exactly what you are saying, Tony, and that's exactly what you are speaking to the healing of, John. If it is traumatizing, that means that there could be traumatized people in the government. And that becomes important to think about, because if part of the trauma means that you have difficulty relating to other people and their needs, it means that you can end up with a government that's not very good at meeting needs. And some people will think, should we be talking about that? But there's lots of people who think we should be talking about that, which is one of the reasons that I'm quite pleased for this morning to become political along with the personal insights, because it helps us to think about how widely we really need to understand attachment trauma.
I'll come on to that. I think there's a really interesting piece that was shared widely, which was written in The Guardian some time ago, and we'll look at that fairly shortly, by George Monbiot, and also we'll talk about Alex Renton this morning too. But if I could just take this opportunity to read a little bit from the book, which is becoming one of my my regular features of the program, and this is your story, Tony, as you know, Tony's story as a boarding school survivor. Tony trained in art and then art therapy, finds that there's a particular magic in the medium of animation. The form makes it easier, somehow safer to listen to hard to hear subjects. It is indeed hard to listen to his story in the film, which we'll discuss in a moment or two. Tony describes his very first car journey to boarding school as an abduction. When the trunk of his belongings was put in the boot of the car, it felt like he himself was being put into that boot. That trunk was the perfect representation of how he was feeling, bundled up and sent off. In the words of author Nick Duffel, he was being sent to a, quote, a life of neglect dressed up as privileged. And in the film, that was one of the real strong comments that I certainly picked up on, Tony. And also, you know, you mentioned earlier, and I think it's in the film, that you didn't cry or scream or push back because you were too English for that, and that in itself opens up another debate. So tell me about the film and how it came about and how therapeutic it has been for you. You know, when you were putting the animation together and you were producing it. So how did it come about? First of all, tell me the history.
So actually, this is the second version of the film. I originally did the film because I wanted to think about the link between the work that I do. So I work a lot in prisons. And then suddenly I thought, oh yeah, okay, boarding school and prison, maybe not that different in many ways. A different social class perhaps, but still. And then I wasn't quite satisfied with that, so I kind of came back to, and I suspect I will keep coming back to this subject and keep making this film. I think there's three reasons I've sort of, in hindsight, identified why I made it and what I wanted to get out of it. So the first one was a therapeutic reason, and that's I wanted to make sense of my experiences through art making and storytelling, and in a way that's embodied, and there's a sort of magic to animation. And there's a quote by, I think, Stephen Gross, who says, if you don't find a way of telling your story will tell you. And I think I felt that my story was telling me. So it's certainly in early adulthood. There was also a social reason why I wanted to make this film, and we've touched on this already. I wanted to challenge the idea that sending a small child away to board, away from their home and family, was perhaps not a good idea. You know, I wanted to challenge the idea that it was a good idea. And for me, it is in a way a form of abduction, in which children have to grow up too fast, and maybe not at all. I also wanted to question, and again we've touched on the government, whether it's wise to choose people who've had that experience as our leaders, people who are in charge of our well-being, our health, our prosperity. People who've been through, for me, is a toxic mix of privilege and abandonment. So I think that was what I wanted to explore. And the third reason, so it was a long answer to your question, I think probably the most compelling reason actually is I wanted to make a piece of art. I wanted to make a piece of art that's beautiful. I don't mean in a prettified way, but beautiful and powerful. Because I think there's something about, well, trauma always involves loss. And I think there's something about making art and trying to make it as well and as beautiful as you can, which can in a way make up for that loss, is in a way a kind of compensation.
The film we're talking about is Norton Grimm and Me, 2019, which is the second version. So quite a few people are asking that. We have got a clip. I don't know whether you feel it would be appropriate at this point to play the clip. Okay, so
okay, I'm going to do that now.
Well, it wasn't quite like that. Perhaps abduction is the wrong word. Maybe a bit dramatic. For starters, was not me put in the boot, but my trunk, with all of my clothes in it. My pants, white shirts, grey socks, blazer, cap, even a kilt, handkerchiefs, to not crying, and shorts, not long trousers. I didn't need to be gagged or trussed up in rope and blankets. I didn't scream, pound my fists, object, or even cry. I haven't actually since. It was far more English than that. Buttoned up, motion shut away, desperate, polite and strangely awkward. I went, if not willingly, then certainly meekly. I didn't put up a fight or even argue against it, even though every bone in my body did not want to go.
When I first saw that before the book launch, I was struck at how incredibly, the word I used at the time when I first saw it was dark. And it really struck home for me. And I had a bit of a personal epiphany actually about my stepfather, and we might talk about that later in the broadcast, because he went to boarding school as well. But Tony, was all that going on in your head at the time, or was all that developed over a period of time? The more that you thought about your experience.
Well, I think the thing that it's normal, it means that you don't question it. And so for most of my adult life, I haven't really questioned it. Even during my art therapy training, through years of therapy, it never came up. So I would say in the last 5-6 years, I've started to think about this. So no, it's something that's really recent. And I think that is normal. And I think that's usual actually for many people who went to boarding school. Many people find themselves, suddenly I'm an art therapist or suddenly I'm a psychotherapist, but they don't quite know why. Suddenly they're working with people who are traumatized, working with people who are kind of incarcerated or exiled, or which is the case for me. And then you start to maybe question how you got there. And so I think that's I've only started to question it recently, and really I've been having therapy with someone, the first person who's actually acknowledged that boarding school is traumatic. So many therapists, and I noticed there's a quote, something on the chat thing from Francesca, about that. So I think there's, I think we're still very slow to catch up with this. And I want to add my voice. And I'm very glad that Suzanne has picked it up.
I wanted and was honored to tell your story, Tony, because we are talking a lot more about trauma, and I'm very glad of that in our society. ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, has helped us to do that. Perhaps a growing understanding of attachment has helped us to do that. But one of the limitations is that we often think that it is those communities over there who are vulnerable communities and lower socioeconomic deprived communities. Those communities often have many difficulties. There's lots of chaotic families. There might be drug use, and absolutely there's poverty. We need to think about all of those things. But we kind of have a tendency to think that it is only those communities where there's difficulty. And what Tony's story helps us to do is to think in a broader, more general sense. And in fact, it is the darkness of his story, and because we are faced with it in his film, that I'm felt really honored and pleased that he was happy to be in the book, because he forces us to see it. And I'm really grateful to you for that, Tony, because it's easy to look away. And I want us to be able to look at these difficult things with curiosity and compassion and insistence that we will look more closely at the emotional needs of children.
John Fulton, if I could come to you, it is indeed a wonderful piece of art that Tony has produced, and I do not tire. As daunting as I can get, or daunted as I can get when I'm watching it, I can watch it time and time again. There are some similarities, John, I believe, between Tony's story and your story in the early days, although you didn't go to boarding school. But would you like to share that with us?
Sure. All my life I've had long-term conditions, and in childhood I had severe asthma and bronchitis, as you might hear. And what was interesting for me was it took me a long time, as it did with Tony, to kind of recognise the impact of those separations, the separations when I was taken into hospital. And in 1 year, for example, I missed, I think, 7 of the 8 or 9 months of schooling. And I was in hospital for such a long time. And I remember particularly it was the time of JFK. I think the trauma, I remember, even though I couldn't breathe, screaming about being taken away despite a dysfunctional house. My father was alcoholic, and it was an uncomfortable place to be. But then even leaving that to go into hospital and be, I suppose, a very small fish. You kind of, you lose yourself in the transition from being in the home and getting nurture, whatever nurture is there, to, experiencing something which is very alien, and that alienation and alienness, I think, really goes deep. And I found it fascinating, a bit like Tony, that art was a thing that saved me. I was fortunate in that my mother always made sure I had some kind of art materials, and I would draw and draw and draw and draw, and that was a way of stepping out of that which was out there different faces, different people, all the insecurities, to finding a secure space inside. And I think that's where I feel very passionate about people being enabled at whatever age to just play, to do art. It doesn't matter what it's like, but particularly, I think, for people who struggle. Just for people who struggle, it's an affective reprocessing that happens when you do art. And we were, I'm sure it still happens. Don't make a mess on that table. Don't drop that. You have to kind of manage the kind of expressiveness. And if parents, schools, whatever out there can create a space where children can be messy, it's so important, just to be able to kind of go in, and it doesn't matter about the furniture or the wallpaper or whatever. Anyway, yes.
John, that's a great point. Suzanne, if I can come to you on that, do you think more parents have been interacting? We talk about homeschooling and all that sort of stuff, but do you think there's been more art going on in households across the nation since we've been in lockdown?
Do you know, Gary, it's a really interesting question, and I don't really know the answer to it, but the question points to an even bigger point. Okay, so I'm watching some people come in the chat and saying that they have friends who went to boarding school and they're not sure that their friends would see themselves as traumatized. Okay, and the reason that that's relevant to your question is there's a big insight here. Understanding that some people who went to boarding school could have been traumatized is a surprise. And no, it doesn't apply to everybody, but the idea that it could apply to anybody is not one that we've been willing to think about. What if we move that to deprived families? We can sort of think that all families who come from an area of poverty and deprivation are all somehow equally traumatized. They're not. There's lots of families who meet their children's needs living in deprived communities. And so it's easy to tar everybody with that brush. And we need to think in more depth about the differences in families so that we can understand that what matters is meeting children's emotional needs and how do we boost parents' ability to do that. Now let's move to lockdown. There will be some families, Gary, who did exactly what you just said. They have enjoyed lockdown. They have had more time with their children. They have done more art. They have had time to have messy play. There are families who have benefited from lockdown. And there are families who will have struggled terribly. Domestic violence has gone up. We don't actually know the rates, but in fact, there was just a resilience task force released this week to try and address mental health. So we need to think deeply about the diversity in that experience. What let some families thrive and what made it harder for other families? We need to think about that diversity everywhere, in families of deprivation, in families of boarding school, in people who grew up in areas of deprivation, who went to boarding school. If we can think about that diversity, we really get the point of attachment, and we can think about how Tony and John's insights apply to COVID lockdown as much as they do to boarding school and hospitalization.
Tony, you were quite clearly loved by your parents. Did they ever find out how sending you to boarding school affected you? Did you ever have that conversation with them?
Not with my dad. He died some years ago. And probably he was the one who was carrying on the tradition. He went to boarding school. My mum, before she died, about a year ago, I think before she died, I mentioned that I was making a film about it, and she went into she got so upset that I was traumatized by it, the thought of it. that I had to start to manage her rather than she couldn't take it on. I think she was devastated, and it sort of made me feel a bit guilty for bringing it up. And I think that's been the pattern of protecting them. They're both quite vulnerable people, I would say. And so I think, yeah, it didn't totally help me to have that conversation.
May I ask one more question about your family, Tony? Are you comfortable with that? You mentioned that your sisters went to boarding school.
Yeah.
How are they now? Are they pro sending? If I don't know whether they have children, but continuing the cycle, because I know that it was something that was in your family. Has the cycle been broken? Have they had different experiences? I'm just keen to find out.
That's a good question. My elder sister sent her children to boarding school. I mean, she would say that they asked to go, and they went to a local boarding school. With her eldest son, she bitterly regrets that now. And so I've had that conversation with her, not in depth particularly. So they regret it. Yeah. And funnily enough, my eldest sister was a matron for a very brief period in my prep school, and so she saw how grim and terrible it was. But again, I think that this idea of tradition is so embedded and so hard to break that it's hard to. It's a kind of neural pathway almost. Is that it's very hard to break that. And I'm interested, as something I wanted to get in, I'm kind of very interested that even if you don't totally buy that boarding school can be damaging for young children, it's still got charitable it's still in doubt, but it's still got charitable status. And so it's validated by the state. And also it's still not mandatory for private schools to report cases of abuse to the local authorities, which I find quite devastating and shocking, really.
I just saw something on chat. So something on chat came up about the royal family there, and it's been well documented that Prince Charles had a terrible time at boarding school, up north.
Crown. Yeah.
Suzanne, is this something that you believe is typically British? I'll tell you where I'm going with this question. Is you're American. Is there an American equivalent, or is it just purely us here in the UK?
Yes and no. Sending children away and boarding schools has been used in all sorts of ways. So I'm watching the chat come in. People are thinking about residential schools. They're thinking about what it's like to be adopted. They're thinking about separations in the way that we need to be thinking about them broadly. Therefore, separation and sending children away to school can be used in all sorts of different ways in a culture. So in Britain, it's particularly tied to class. And that's what you're saying, Tony, is that when it becomes a normative for a class to behave in a particular way, it just becomes part of the definition or kind of the normality of that group. So that's British, I think. Mm-hmm. It helped with the empire, certainly. But in other cultures, for instance, in Canada, there's been quite a lot of looking at what happened when you sent Indigenous children away to boarding school, and how that helped to destroy the Indigenous communities in Canada. The same thing happened in America, although it hasn't been talked about quite so much. And and in Australia. And so sending children away to boarding school can have lots of different cultural functions. You can actually think that you're doing something really good for those children. I'm sure when boarding school was put together, we thought maybe that we were going to send Indigenous children away and help to improve their lives or turn them into different kinds of people. Separating people from the place that they belong, even when that place is chaotic, brings new kinds of trauma. And that was your point, John. You had a chaotic family, so going in, but you wanted to be with a chaotic family rather than in this alien environment of hospital. And then if I can just say one more thing,
Sure.
trying to work out that story is very difficult. That's both your points, Tony and John. Trying to understand what happened to you at a time before you could understand the pain. The earlier it is, you don't even have words that help you with that. Unraveling your story so that you can claim it as your own is where the healing lies, and art helps with that. Anything you can do to reclaim your story as your own it's not what happened to you, it's making sense of what happened to you.
Absolutely.
That healing lies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, John, do you want to come in on that?
Well, just I totally agree, and I think there's something about the capacity to reflect as being so important, because when people are traumatized or frustrated or angry or hurt, thinking goes out the window, and we kind of act in to how we're feeling. So, for example, if a child is really, really distressed, can't be soothed, then it stirs up a lot of anxiety in the carer, inverted commas, and then the kind of breakdown happens where the capacity to think, reflect, understand what's being communicated, etc., goes. And we need to be able to stop and stand, and I call it mentalize. We need to be able to mentalize what's going on in the here and now. And you can only do that, I think, by having a kind of embedded reflective process, which is where I feel I'm very, very fortunate in having used, training, having gone into therapy numerous times, etc., as also, a bit like Tony, to understand what on earth happened. Sorry, Tony.
No, I just wanted to add to that, really. I think there's something about the fact that art making is an embodied activity as well. You do it with your body, you do it with your hands, not just your mind, which quite often gone offline in a traumatized state. And so and we all know that trauma affects the body as well as the mind. So I think it's really important that way. There's also a series of problem solving when you're making art. When you're trying to tell a particular story as well, I'm thinking, how on earth am I going to animate this bit? And it's almost like you when you begin to solve just those problems on a metaphorical level, you can't solve the problem going to boarding school. It's already happened, it's been and gone, it's done. But you can kind of solve problems on a different level. And I think that's kind of very valuable.
Yeah.
And if I can then add, that's why it is so important. So Pauline Scott is here this morning. I've seen her in the chat. And she runs Lullaby Lane. And she, in fact, will be here for a future episode of Tigers and Teddies. And she says repeatedly, in order to be present in the lives of children, we need to be present in the lives of the adults who are with those children. Because it's the adults who will help those children to make sense of what is happening to them now. We need adults who can self-regulate enough to not get pulled into the child's trauma at the moment, that they can comfort them, that they can help the child to have words that make sense of what they're feeling, that can help to make sense in that moment. Yep. Because the more sense making you can do around the events themselves at the moment, the less toxic they become and the less they leave a painful legacy. And Tony, your story is really powerful, because when your mother realized what had happened for you in boarding school, that she had sent you off to, it was too painful for her to face up to that. And so she couldn't actually then help you resolve it and make sense of it. She couldn't be present for you even years down the line, because it was too painful to face up to what she had unintentionally caused you. Mm-hmm. The more adults don't have to live in shame about the pain that they caused, even when they didn't mean to, the more they don't have to live in their own shame the more they can be helpful to their children in resolving the pain that they did cause. And so, Tony, you were cheated, in a sense, of the healing she might have been able to help you to have, because she was too pained by her realization of what she did. And in order to overcome that, we need to address shame. And so just understanding all of these little links, we could talk about this for hours. We only have an hour this morning, but if it starts to unravel some links for the 118 people who have joined us this morning, then we start to knit some healing for wider society too, which is the whole point of this series.
Of course. So it's 11:15 here in the UK. We've got about another 15 minutes or so left. I do want to touch on something that, because I did promise we would touch on it, but I know it could go into a much wider debate. And it's that point that was it was the piece in The Guardian over 7 months ago, well over now, by the author, the writer George Monbiot, and he talked about his time in boarding school. But let me just read a clip from his editorial. There are two stark facts about British politics. The first is that it is controlled to a degree unparalleled in any other Western European nation by a tiny, unrepresentative elite. Like almost every aspect of public life here, government is dominated by people educated first at private schools, then at either Oxford or Cambridge. The second is that many of these people possess a disastrous set of traits: dishonesty, class loyalty, and an absence of principle. And he then goes on about the Prime Minister. I won't go there, but there's another little piece that I want to just say. This was interesting. This talks about his first night at boarding school. On my first night at boarding school, I felt entirely alone. I was shocked, frightened, and intensely homesick, but I soon discovered that expressing these emotions, instead of bringing help and consolation, attracted a gloating, predatory fascination. The older boys, being vulnerable themselves, knew exactly where to find your weaknesses. So there's a couple of points there, certainly reflecting your first opening quotes, Tony, from George Monbiot. But let's go back to the political elite. How dangerous is that? I mean, he's got a very distinct and a very definite view, but if 2/3 of Boris Johnson's cabinet fall into that category, how dangerous could that be for our future, for the country, and all the ramifications that go with that?
It's speculation, but I mean, I just wanted to share. I know that part of the reason I got sent to boarding school was because, particularly with my dad, he didn't want me to mix with the lower socioeconomic class. He was a snob, and I think that is an attitude. I think a lot of people send their children to boarding school, whatever class that they're in, because they think that there's a better class of people in a boarding school. And I think we're seeing that in the government today. I think the lower socioeconomic classes are badly served by people who've been to boarding school, quite honestly. So I think it's really dangerous in that way. I think there's a lot of talk at the moment with George Floyd about white privilege, and I think boarding school is the headquarters of it, really. It's the start, it's the training for it. So I think just to bring it in, to sort of make that point, I'm aware that there's marches going on today, and I think that speaks to that, I'm afraid.
Suzanne, do you think that people, let's say we have business leaders and we have political leaders in the country that have been to boarding school? Does that make for a less sympathetic nation?
It has every potential to make for a less sympathetic nation. On the other hand, there are lots of people who have been to boarding school who are trying to make sense of what happened to them. And in healing that, actually creates even greater compassion. In other words, they understand the pain that is caused, and in making sense of it, they can see pain more widely distributed. So it's the making sense of it. What you just said is really interesting, Tony. It's the privilege part of it. When you don't recognize that you are traumatized, and tons of people don't recognize that they're traumatized. They would be shocked to use that word trauma. Lots of therapists don't recognize trauma. That, Tony, you just gave us a story that lots of therapists that you'd worked with didn't talk about boarding school. I know people who were in a hospital like John, and they spent lots of years in psychiatric treatment, but nobody asked about their early hospital experiences. So it's when you don't recognize that you're traumatized, that when it's unresolved, you create pain for other people. And then when you think that you are entitled to that, when you slap entitlement on the top of it, you have no reason to look at it. So the blow up about Dominic Cummings, and I wrote a piece about Dominic Cummings, is because people are getting a sense of that privilege. There was a story on the news just yesterday about a single mother who wrote to Dominic Cummings and talked about the intense distress that she had about not having anyone else to turn to. And now there is a new shift in that single parents can create a bubble with another household now. If we had done that early in lockdown, we would have created connection for people who needed support. And we would have, I think that would have helped the emotional difficulties that tons of our children will now have experienced and will carry into their future. We do not put connection and relationships at the center of our policies. And we need to, in order to prevent damage to our children and continuing damage to lots of adults. And that is the point of this series. And that is the point of having John and Tony here this morning. Tony's story and John's story of hospitalization forces us to think about that. And I'm so grateful to both of you for telling those brave stories.
I think it's also in the interest of balance is opportune to say that even if we think of the government, there will be people in opposition that have also been to boarding schools. So this isn't purely about the government that's in power now. I think it's talking about the power base across the piece, and of course in terms of business business leaders.
Jump in
John.
there with you use the words power base. And something that's been echoing, kind of privilege, and then the word entitlement. And I think when you get these words in the mix of things, we really do have to stop and think just what is the function of privilege, entitlement, and power, where it kind of is a controlling thing, and we've tried falsely to control our worlds, and here we are in a pandemic where we have no control over that which can kill us. So it's a kind of fascinating way to think about how we maybe push shame away because it's unbearable.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, John, I thought that was a fantastic intervention and a great point, well made as well. We've got a few minutes left. We've got a few things to do before the end of the program, and I want to make sure that everybody stays with us because we've got something pretty special coming up. And I want to finish on some positives. John, I loved your story when you were talking about how art saved you, and particularly then when you were a teacher, you saw how art was saving younger people. Did you make the connection between your need for art and their need for art? Did you have a light bulb moment at any point? Did it just go click?
Only insofar as I knew how important art had been for me, and I also became aware, having gone to art college and so on, the role and function that it took for me as being a bit like Tony, finding a personal voice. So I remember in particularly doing a huge painting, which I thought was about Thatcherism, but in fact it was about me. And it was about rage, fury, and kind of just being totally outraged by what Thatcher was doing in terms of stripping away social norms, and, you know, again, creating a divided society, which was very much them and us. And although that wasn't her intention, I'm sure that it's what happened, you know. And I remember things like Clause 28, funding for schools being really severely cut. And again, that ties in with Tony's experience or understanding of charitable status for public school. You know, I mean, it's shocking. Anyway, that's my personal view, I have to say. That, yes, I suppose in all of this, I recognise that art has got a very potent and powerful sort of function for all of us, that then in our own worlds, different priorities take place. So, for example, at primary school, we kind of see, when I was teaching in primary schools, I would see that art was the kind of, at that time, and I'm talking over 20 years ago, it was a kind of a luxury. And the focus was on the 3 R's and learning and socialization and so on. But the kind of natural processes that we see preschool, where children are freely engaging in telling stories in whatever way they can, whether it's a stick person or whatever, they become enlivened and they can make connections. And I think that, for me, is what I saw in the school, where if I encourage children to think outside the box, my goodness, could they do it? You know, whether it was making films or drama or whatever.
Thank you, John. Yeah. Tony, at the end of Norton, Grimm and Me 2019, it said to be continued. So when can we expect a continuation? Have you started it? Have you thought about it? I don't want you to let any secrets out of the bag, but any sort of timelines?
Yeah, no secrets. There's no. I'm still processing this one. I think I want to do a few updates on this film. I think I want to. It almost feels out of date now because of the COVID crisis and the impact from that. So I think I want to make a few additions. I haven't gone into the school that much in my films. I realise I haven't talked that much about what happened within it. I don't know if I ever will, but you know, maybe not. But yeah, don't hold your breath. It'll be a while. I suppose I wanted to say. There's a couple of things I wanted to say just to sort of before we finish. It's sort of, I suppose there's another question was that I was really taken in Suzanne's book, among many things, but from the Violence Reduction Unit, who talked about violence being a disease that's something that you can catch. And I suppose my question is, what do you catch from going to boarding school other than a sort of job in the city or a place in the cabinet? And I think that's a kind of ongoing question which I will continue to explore. But also I want to build on this work build on the work of people like Nick Duffel, Joy Shavarian, Alex Renton and Thurston Bassett, who is here today. And, you know, I think acknowledge also Suzanne's work as well, because I think, but from an art perspective. So I think me and John will continue, because art has a therapeutic but also a socio role.
Well, let's see how our young people, and I believe that they're tuning in this morning, have been taking part in art. As you may be aware, if you're a regular viewer, Suzanne has been encouraging young people to send in pictures of their teddies. It's been phenomenally successful. But so first of all, we've got two things to show you. First of all, is a picture from a young lady called Molly. And Molly is aged 5. Good morning to you, Molly. We can see that. And that is your bear called Iggle. Iggle. I love that name, Iggle. That's a fantastic drawing. So thank you very much indeed, Molly, for sending that in to us. We're really, really grateful for that. And Suzanne, is it something that we're going to encourage? You know, if you want to draw something, draw it, send it to us, but preferably your teddies.
Well, do you know, it was originally just for the launch, but I continue to get pictures of teddies. So let's just do that. If children want to continue to draw us pictures of your teddies and send them in, we will find ways to keep turning them back out and sharing them with the public. And that feels really extra important to me at the moment, because one of the debates about going back to school now that COVID lockdown is starting to ease, is whether or not children can bring their teddies and other items from home into school with them. And if we don't think about the importance of teddies and helping to keep children feeling safe, we're going to be sending children back into school settings in a scared state. And if we don't realize that, we'll cause them difficulties. So I want us to think about the power of teddies to create safety for children.
And our next piece and final piece, and wherever you're watching, don't go anywhere, because I guarantee you're going to love this next bit. Because this blew me away during the week. So secondly, we have a film premiere. Tony, John, this is the first time we've ever done this. So we have a film premiere, and it's from a young man called Kai Davis. And Kai is 9 years old. I believe Kai is watching this. And his film is all about his teddy and how it makes him feel brave. And his mum, Charlene, said to us, and I think we can share this, Kai often fears that others will laugh at him for still having a teddy. But I tell him all the time that it's what he thinks that matters. And if he needs him to feel safe, then he is never too old. And we are really, really honoured, Kai, to be able to show your film to the world this morning.
This is a story about me and my teddy. I got Teddy the first day I was born, and he's brown and wears a blue suit. Teddy is really special, and he's always there for me when I'm sad and nervous. I get really nervous when trying new things like the guitar. Teddy helps me to feel safe. When I was 4, I learned to ride my bike, and then I was scared, and then Teddy was there. Sometimes I'm nervous to go to school, so I bring Teddy in my backpack with me. I use my Rolling Stones to talk about my feelings, and Teddy likes to join in. My favourite thing to do is going in the hot tub, so I made one for Teddy, and it makes us happy. When I go to bed, I like to snuggle in with Teddy, and it makes me have a good sleep. Teddy keeps me safe and keeps the bad dreams away.
Isn't that great? Tony, you're our resident filmmaker. What do you think?
I loved it. I love the hot tub. I'm sort of worried that Teddy will take quite a long time to get dried afterwards. I hope there's a hairdryer for him. So maybe that's a follow-up. Yeah, it's brilliant. And it's great that there's something really important about that in terms of the teddy bear being there, whether it's there literally or in his mind, to support him with difficult things. So well done, Kai. Brilliant, and keep going with that, definitely.
And John, a fantastic piece of art.
What I'm amazed at is the amount of work that's gone into that piece. Kai's in the process. I think Kai is reflecting, but also finding a way to kind of connect with himself and also let other people know about the importance of emotions, which, for someone who's 9, that's fantastic.
So Kai, many congratulations.
Can I just add?
Yes, of course.
Kai, just to reassure him about people laughing at him with teddy bears. I work with men who've been in gangs and work in prison, and they've got in their cell teddy bears. So teddy bears are important to them as well. So it's not just even for children. And I've got.
Yeah, even 50-year-old broadcasters have them as well.
I was so honored and delighted that Kai sent that film because he had been inspired by this series. He'd been inspired by other adults in his lives, his mom, and those of us that he'd been seeing on the screen, to talk about his Teddy. And so I was just blown away that he had the courage to ask, could we show his film? He created it for us. And in other words, he's really stepped out of his comfort zone. So Kai, I also want to say, well done. John has suggested that you might come and have a look here in Dundee at Duncan of Jordanstone's animation department. And I'm saying that out loud so that Dundee University can hear us say that, so that maybe we might be able to get you a tour of Duncan of Jordanstone as a way of helping to inspire you to keep up with this interest of yours. Thank you for allowing us to premiere your film, Kai.
Brilliant. So we are slightly over, but well deserved. Why we should be. Remember, hashtag Tigers and Teddies if you are commenting on this program this afternoon or during the week. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and thoroughly look forward to the next subject. And remember, the book is still there, and the book, Suzanne, is still going really, really well.
The book's going really well. You can get it from the website, and we'll ship it right out to you. And just keep spreading the word, because the more of us who understand the power of connection and attachment, the more of us who lead lives where we can thrive, which is why in the next episode, we're going to be talking about attachment theory for parents to help them to feel more confident about what they're seeing in the raising of their children.
Wonderful. Tony Gammage and John Fulton, thank you for being our guest this morning. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your stories. They have been absolutely tremendous. Suzanne, I will see you in 2 weeks. But in the meantime, everybody stay safe.
You were much better than Robin Day.
You're a lovely man. You're a lovely man. So from Gary Robinson here in Scotland, and from our guests, and to you around the world, wherever. I'm blushing now, you see that. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Bye-bye. Have a safe week. Take care.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.